Someday they'll put this in a museum, I think. I don't know, it's getting pretty old. Appreciate you all coming out this morning, being with us. I want to thank again this congregation. I want to thank, I meant to say this before, for the many prayers and comments you had about my wife, Janice. She is doing some better, has a ways to go, and we really appreciate your prayers. You know, the Bible says, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things were added unto you, and I hope we all do that this morning. The patriarchal period. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13 says, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. And aren't we that too? What a joy it is to talk about this period of biblical history. For the Jews, it was a time from Adam unto Moses, as others have talked about. It ended with the coming of the Old Covenant, or the law of Moses. For the Gentiles, it continued up until the beginning of Christ's kingdom in Acts 2, the church. But we're going to talk about this morning about mainly Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. I'm so thankful that Moses and the Holy Spirit have recorded this for us in chapters 12 through 50 of the Holy Bible, approximately 1921 BC to 1635 BC, use Ussher's chronology. And the call of Abraham, or Abram, to the death of the patriarch Joseph. What do we learn from this period of Bible history? One thing we learn, and I hope this sticks in your mind today, sticks in mine, the providential care of God for his people. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Number two, the continuing goal of God for mankind's salvation through Jesus Christ. The third point, the trials and tribulations of ordinary men and women who strove to obey God. Now we know where all this took place. It took place where now the same area is inflamed in war. All the way from the Persian Gulf, called the Fertile Crescents, up through what is now Iran and Iraq, through Syria and Lebanon, down to the Nile River, a moist area along the edge of a great desert, the Arabian desert, and there flowed through that arc many civilizations, empires, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Hittites, the Phoenicians, the Philistines, the Egyptians, you go on, many more too. And through that same route around that desert came the flows of peoples, languages, ideas, religions, writings, and goods. And where did God place his patriarchs but smack dab in the middle of that Fertile Crescent in Palestine, what some have called the cockpit of the Middle East. Let's this morning talk about Abraham. Terah was the father of Abram and Sarai, the grandfather of Lot, took his family out of that urbane, by their standards, city of Ur of the Chaldees, which is now in modern-day southern Iraq, northwestward 500 miles to the frontier of Haran, now in the southeastern part of Turkey. After the death of Terah, Abram was called by God to leave his home and his kinfolks, Terah's family, and to go into a land that I will show thee. Now here was this 75-year-old man. Jerry, you're almost there. 75-year-old man. And yet God told him, gave him a promise, and I will make of thee a great nation. I will bless thee and make thy name great. And thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curse thee. And in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And for the next 100 years, God would elaborate on those great promises and begin to fulfill them. So Abram, Sarai, and Lot, by faith, Hebrews 11 verse 8 tells us, left all of that behind them. Talk about going into the mission field. Even idolatry, Joshua tells us in Joshua 24 verse 2. And moved west to Shechem. And there among their idolatrous Canaanite neighbors, Abram builds an altar to the living God and offers sacrifices to him and renews his promise. And God renews that promise. You know, brethren, every day that we live on this earth, the promises of Jesus are renewed in our lives. Matthew chapter 28, verse 20, behold, I am with you always, even unto the end of the age. Like Abram, Sarah and Lot lived in a neo-pagan, hostile land in which we live in now. And we live in it by faith. And we live through it, ever looking to the promise of God. Because of famine, finally, in Palestine, Abram moves his family south to go down to Egypt. There we see the weaker side of Abraham. That's what I love about the Bible. It gives you the good, the bad, and the ugly. And this was, of course, Abram lied about his relationship with Sarai. She was half-sister. He says, oh, please tell everybody you're my sister. And Pharaoh says, whoa, there's another wife from my harem. And takes her. And the Lord plagues Pharaoh in his house, Genesis 12, verse 7. And Pharaoh turns around and rebukes Abram. God uses pagan prince to rebuke his servant. And this would happen another time, too, in the case of Abimelech in chapter 20. Abimelech would rebuke Abram, too. This white lie, that's why Colossians 3, verse 9, Paul says, lie not to one another, seeing that you have put off the old man with his deeds. God doesn't lie, thank goodness. We shouldn't either. But God smiled upon Abram and his family. He was very rich. He was loaded. To put it, I don't know. I've never seen a estimate of his worth, but it was a lot. Genesis 13, verse 2 says, very rich, as was his nephew Lot. There was a clash between their herdsmen and Abram in an expression, I believe, of love, says, we be brethren. Genesis 13, verse 8. And he offers him a choice. You take of this inheritance item. You take what you want. And Lot, in a classic example of bad judgment, chooses the well-watered but morally repugnant Jordan River Valley containing Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plain. And Lot knows already, because in Genesis 13, verse 13, it tells us God knew what Sodom was like, and probably Lot did too. But he goes there for materialistic reasons that he would regret. You know, Proverbs 14, verse 12 says, there is a way which seemeth right unto a man, the end thereof is the ways of death. And that was certainly true with Lot. But here God renews to Abram that land promise at Bethel. And he promises even more. He talks about what I've called the other day the messianic seed promise. Genesis 13, verse 16, I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth. So if man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed be numbered. And it says, Abraham believed and moved and settled by the oaks of Mamre. Chapter 13, verse 18. Abraham believed. And that would be his headquarters for many years. But then he receives some distressing news. He finds out that a group of foreign kings have come down from basically Mesopotamia. And they apparently had some sort of alliance or tribute from the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, kings of the cities of the plain. They'd rebelled against them, so they go down and they capture the king of Sodom, as well as Lot and his family. Now, this next episode in chapter 14 shows us that Abram was no illiterate nomad out there, shepherd, because he assembles a strike force of 318 of his armed, trained servants, plus his Amorite allies and their forces, and like some commando leader, you know, SEAL team, whatever, he divides them up in half, and they attack at night, and he overwhelms, with God's help, the enemy. And he takes all this battle loot, and the sinful king of Sodom says, oh, you keep what you want. And Abram says, I don't take anything of yours. But he does give a tithe of the spoil to King Melchizedek of Salem, the priest of the Most High God. Genesis chapter 14, verse 18 through 20. A type of Christ, writer of Hebrews tells us, Hebrews 5, verse through chapter 7. After this great battle, God appears to Abraham and says, fear not, Abram, I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward. Genesis 15, verse 1. He assures Abram that he will have an heir, and refers that your descendants will be as the stars of the heaven. Now Moses records the reaction of this devout old man. He says, and he believed in the Lord, and he counted to him for righteousness. Genesis 15, verse 6. Apostle Paul would later use Abram's faith as an example of justification by faith and not by works of merit like circumcision, since Abram was not yet circumcised. And they seal that covenant with animal sacrifices. And God informs him again, reveals more to him, and says, your descendants will go into a foreign land for 400 years, chapter 15, verse 13. But they will return to Palestine in the fourth generation. Why? Why give all that time? Genesis 15, verse 16, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. God gave those ungodly people 400 years to repent. But then that great heir comes. When Abram is 99 years old, God renews that promise and changes his name to Abraham, father of many nations. Sarah's name is changed from Sarai to Sarah. And he makes an everlasting covenant with Abraham and his descendants. And he says there's going to be a physical sign of that covenant. It will be the circumcision of all males in your household 8 days old and older. Now, what does Abraham do? 99 years old, successful, wealthy man. He falls on his face and laughs and says in his heart, shall a child be born unto me that be 100 years old? This was amazement. And shall Sarah bear a child unto him that is 100 years old? So Sarah, who's 90 years old, bear? He then says, oh, but Lord, if you'll only remember Ishmael, who was his 13-year-old son by his concubine, Hagar. God says, no. It's not going to come through Hagar. It's going to come through Sarah. And his name will be called Isaac, which means laughter. And God's promised son would be a direct descendant of Isaac, Matthew chapter 1, verse 2. And Isaac will be born a year later. A sign of his obedient faith. Here this 99-year-old man, that same day, had Ishmael and himself and all probably 318 or more, and male servants, probably not even counting their children, circumcised that very day. Genesis 17, verse 13. That to me is amazing every time I read that. Then soon thereafter, 3 heavenly visitors arrive to visit Abraham, and they say, reassure what God has said. Sarah will soon be pregnant with a promised son. And Sarah is listening outside the tent, and she laughs. And the angel tells her, is anything too hard for the Lord? That's the same thing the angel told Mary. When she said, how can this be? I've not known a man. How can I be pregnant of the Son of God? She said, is anything impossible? Is anything too hard for the Lord? Luke chapter 1, verse 37. Because the birth of Isaac would be second to the birth of Jesus Christ, being a miracle. And then he informs Abram of the coming judgment upon Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plain. The Lord said, because the city cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great and because their sin is very grievous. Genesis 18, verse 20. And I think one of the most remarkable conversations in the Bible. And I always think of Abraham as this businessman doing this. He says, Lord, but if there be just 50, we use sparingly. The Lord says, finally it gets him down to 10. That may have been how many were in Lot's family there in Sodom. But he agrees if there's 10 righteous, which there weren't, I'll spare Sodom. So these two angels rather go to Sodom. They are shown hospitality by righteous Lot. Then comes along this licentious mob, wants to rape the angels. They are struck blind, showing, I believe, their moral blindness. And by the way, the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plain was not inhospitality, but homosexuality, homosexual behavior, as Jude verse 7 tells us. As I wrote this, 18 states, United States, had either voted for same-sex marriage or been forced to accept it by a licentious, ungodly judge. And I don't know what the number is now, 21, I think, something like that. Incredible. This nation that was founded upon biblical principles of righteousness and rights derived from the Almighty joins the moral sewers of ancient Rome and Greece and modern Europe. But only 4 souls escaped Sodom. Lot, his wife, of course, turned into a pillar of salt because she looked back, and his 2 daughters. And I'm not going to elaborate on it except to say, in Genesis 19, verse 28, and he, Abraham, looked towards Sodom and Gomorrah and towards all the land of the plain and beheld, and lo, the smoke of the country went up as the smoke of a furnace. I hope that never happens to our beloved country. But the greatest test of Abraham's faith comes in chapter 22. God says, take now thy son, thine only son. By the way, he had total, later the Bible records, would have 8 sons. 7 besides Isaac. Thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, get thee unto the land of Moriah, offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will show thee. Genesis 22, verse 2. Was Abraham's faith greater than the faith of his idolatrous neighbors? And the brother and I were talking about this earlier, that would go out and sacrifice their little children to dumb idols. Was Abraham's faith as great as that? Was it greater? And also, would God ever ask of a human being something he would not do himself? Now we see here God open up the curtain a little bit to his plan, to his scheme of redemption, his plan of salvation. Now there's a few things we need to set right here that Hollywood does not get right. Abraham, during this episode, was no middle-aged man. Sarah died soon afterwards at 127 years of age. She was 90 when Abraham was 100 and Abraham was 100 when Isaac was born, so that would make him probably 137 years old. Also, there's no indication that Abraham or Isaac resisted God's command or there was some emotional turmoil. At least Abraham and perhaps all of his family believed that God would raise Isaac from the dead, Hebrews 11, verse 19. Also, Isaac was probably not a little child during this test. Based on Sarah's age, he was probably in his 30s, maybe 33 years of age, which was the age Jesus was crucified. Even though Abraham refers to him as the lad in Genesis 22, verse 5. I remember I was about 30 years old, went to work for this fellow before I was preaching, and he was quite a bit older than me, and he referred to me as the lad, too. But still, and one other thing, Isaac carried the wood for his sacrifice. The Lord carried his cross, at least part way, to Calvary. His sacrifice was a type of Christ's sacrifice. Both were willing, subject to their Father's will. But human blood is not shed at Abraham's testing. The angel of the Lord stops Abraham. The sacrifice was complete, I believe, when Abraham raised that blade up, that knife, in anticipation of taking his only son's life, the son of the promise. He staggered not at the promise of God through unbelief, but was strong in faith, giving glory to God, and being fully persuaded that what he had promised he was able to perform, Genesis 4, verse 20 and 21. And he reaffirms after this the promises that he had made to Abraham. The land promise, the messianic seed promise. He says, in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed because thou hast obeyed my voice. Genesis 22, verse 18. That seed, Paul tells us, was the Messiah, Jesus Christ, a direct descendant of Abraham, whose blood washed away my sins. At Calvary, the atonement in God's scheme of redemption would be completed by the shedding of the precious blood of the only begotten Son of God. Now, the time we have left, let's look at the life of Isaac and Jacob. Abraham will continue to be a major force in his son's life for the next 40 years after the death of his wife, Sarah. He arranges a wife for Rebekah from his own people in Mesopotamia, not among the Canaanites, and he lived to be 175 years old. And part of that time, he also knew Jacob and Esau, too, during that time. And he was gathered to his people, Genesis 25, verse 7 and 8. And here these two twin boys, finally, after a period of time, I think it was about 20 years, was born when Isaac was 60 years old. Jacob and Esau. And God warns Rebekah when she feels them moving around. She prays to God. God says, you have two nations in your womb. And of course, one would be Jacob, from which the Messiah would come. The other one would be Esau, which would be a persistent enemy of ancient Israel. Isaac was the quiet herdsman. Esau was the flamboyant hunter. Isaac reveals his worldliness by selling his birthright the promises of God to Abraham and his descendants in a moment of hunger for bread and pottage of lentils. Genesis 25, verse 34. God speaks to Isaac, renewing the same promise he had made to Abraham based on Abraham's loving obedience. Isaac becomes a successful herdsman like his father, and a farmer, by the way. He was concerned about his own mortality, though. And he feels he's going to die. I believe he lived 40 more years, if I remember correctly. Anyway, something like that. But he calls in, he wants Esau, come and bring me venison from the forest and prepare it for me like I like. And he's blind by this time. And I will bless you. Well, Rebekah overhears this, tells Isaac, and tells Jacob, rather, and they come up with this scheme we all know about, and where they disguise everything, and in goes Jacob, receives that blessing. Esau hears about it and wants to kill his brother. And Rebekah and Isaac decide to send Jacob back to the old country, back to her relatives, to find a non-Canaanite wife. Esau had already married some of the Canaanite women. So before he leaves, though, Jacob confers upon Isaac the blessings that God had given Abraham. Jacob travels back and begins to serve his uncle Laban. Not a very good boss, to be sure. Relatives sometimes aren't, are they? He labors for 7 years to wed Laban's youngest daughter, Rachel, but at the wedding night, he discovers that there's been a switcheroo there. And he gets the youngest daughter, the oldest daughter, Leah. And this was due, I didn't put this in the manuscript, but probably to the long veils they would wear at the wedding. But anyway, and he protests, and Laban says, well, just serve me 7 more years. But in a week, what's 7 years between us kinfolks here? But anyway, he decides enough's enough after a couple of years, after those years are up, and he decides he's going back home, but he remembers his estranged brother Esau. He's concerned about him, and on the way back home, he there wrestles with a man. Who is that man? An angel? Some have said even Jesus. Wrestles with him, and Jacob wrestles him down, and he asks him to bless him, and he says, thy name shall no more be Jacob, but Israel. But for as a prince thou hast power with God and men, and hast prevailed. In one of those most touching scenes right after that, though, I think of the Bible, is when Esau and him do meet. And they reconcile and embrace. You would never think that would happen if you read what had happened, but it did. Read also there where, narrow it down a little bit here this morning. God tells Jacob to move to Bethel. There he builds an altar, tells his family to put away the strange gods that are among you. Genesis 35, verse 2. They still had their little household gods and stuff they were carrying around, apparently. Some of his wives. God renews his covenant, but Jacob's family life is not good. His favorite wife, Rachel, dies. His son, Reuben, commits incest with his concubine, Bilhah. His father, Isaac, dies at 180 years of age. But along comes the light of his life, who's been there before, Joseph. Joseph was the apple of his eye. He warns Jacob of his brother's evil deeds, Genesis 37, verse 2. He relays this dream in which the brothers all bow down to him in form of sheaves and so forth of grain. And out of envy, it dawned on me this morning as reading that, why was the Lord given to Caesar, given to Pontius Pilate? Because of envy, John tells us. But anyway, because of envy, his brothers kidnap him and sell him to the midnight traders for 20 pieces of silver. They dip his coat of many colors into goat's blood, and they tell broken man, Jacob, that Joseph had been killed by wild beasts. And what begins next, the little time we have left, is one of the most amazing examples of providence of God, I believe, in the Bible. We must realize that during this difficult time, God was working in the life of Jacob and of Joseph. God was fulfilling that promise he had made. God doesn't forget his promises. That messianic seed promise, that land promise. Let's look at a little bit of the life of the patriarch Joseph. Providence sends a 17-year-old slave to the house of the Egyptian Potiphar, officer of Pharaoh, captain of his guard. And his master saw that the Lord was over him, and the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. But Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him and lies about him. He refused her advance, and she lies about him to Potiphar. Potiphar, I think when I read this, may have seen the ruse behind all this, because he puts Joseph in prison, but it's a special prison. It says, a place where all the king's prisoners were bound, a political prison, Genesis 39, verse 20. And here we see the providence of God at work, and he soon becomes the warden's assistant. While there, after a couple of years, he interprets the dreams of two royal prisoners, the butler and the baker, giving glory to God. Joseph foretold, says that Pharaoh's going to release you, the butler, but he's going to hang the baker. It happened that way. And Joseph says, please remember me to the butler. Well, it takes him 2 years to get over the amnesia. So he has. And God's hands again with faithful Joseph when the butler hears of Pharaoh's dreams, which none of his magicians and soothsayers and wise men could interpret. The butler says, oh, I know somebody that can interpret dreams. They take this 30-year-old slave out of prison, cleans him up, and he stands before the absolute, and I mean absolute, ruler of Egypt. There he interprets his dream as meaning there will be 7 years of plenty, and Egypt followed by 7 years of famine, giving God the glory for the interpretation. He says, Pharaoh, you need to appoint someone to gather 20% of all the crops in the years of plenty to be stored for the 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh said unto his servants, can we find such a one, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? He makes Joseph in one of the most amazing examples of God's care in the Bible, makes him the equivalent of the prime minister, or vizier, as they would call it, of Egypt. And he marvelously carries out his plan to save Egypt from starvation. Well, we know the rest of the story, how Jacob, during that famine, sends 10 of his sons to Egypt to get food. They go, they don't recognize Joseph, he recognizes them. And he gives them a series of tests to see if they've really changed. He finally reveals himself in one of the moving scenes in the Bible, Genesis 45. He just cries, and all the Egyptians, what is this? And he rejoices, and he tells Jacob, go take Jacob and bring him back to this land. So they come and present Jacob and his family at Pharaoh's court. And Joseph warns them, says, don't mention that you're sheep herders. The Egyptians don't like sheep herders because they think it's an abomination. Well, what did they do? As good relatives, they said to Pharaoh, thy servants are shepherds. And Pharaoh proceeds to grant them the best land, what is called Lower Egypt or Goshen, to take care of the royal cattle. And he greets 130-year-old Jacob, and Joseph blesses Pharaoh. Now, there's an interesting thing here about this. Why did Pharaoh do this? I mean, their word Hebrew means sandcrawler, the way I understand it. So why would they do this? Because Pharaoh, it may be because he respected Joseph so much, but it may be also because this Egyptian Pharaoh may not have been an Egyptian. He may have been a member of the Hyksos tribe who had come down from northern Canaan and ruled over Egypt for about 200 years. And maybe he thought, well, this is another non-Egyptian like me, and I trust him. Whatever it was, God's providence was at work. Jacob is 147 years old. He dies in Egypt. Before he dies, he speaks to his sons one last time, and they're a motley crew, I tell you. He singles out Judah, and he tells his tribe, he says, from you the Messiah will come. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh come, till peace come. To him shall be the gathering of the people be, Genesis 49, verse 10. Shiloh means peace, and the Messiah, according to Isaiah 9, verse 6, would be the Prince of Peace. But Jacob especially blessed Joseph and his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and blessed them with a special blessing. And it says, he draws his legs up, and he is gathered to his people. Went to where Abraham and Isaac was, and Sarah. And he is embalmed and placed his body is placed by Joseph, in the cave of Machpelah in Canaan. There you have Abraham, Isaac, Rebekah, and Leah. And I put down in my manuscript a question mark by Rebekah, but I read this morning in Genesis 49 where Jacob says that Rebekah is buried there. So please correct that if you'd like. Now after this period of mourning, Jacob's brothers, they think, well, now he's going to get us. And they had every right to think that, too, what they had done, put him to slavery. And they begged him to forgive him and said Jacob had requested that before he died. And with a magnanimous heart, Joseph forgives them and reveals something into the, I believe, insight into the providence of God. And he'd said this, he says, and Joseph said, "Fear not, for am I in the place of God." Fear not, for am I in the place of God. 17 years earlier, before Jacob's death, Joseph had told his brothers an amazing verse. He says, "Now therefore be not grieved and angry with yourselves, for you sold me hither. For God did send me before you to preserve life. But these 2 years hath the famine been in the land, and there are yet 5 years, in the which shall neither be earing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity in the earth, and to save your life by a great deliverance. So now it was not you that sent me hither, but God. He hath made me a father to Pharaoh, Lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all Egypt." Isn't that wonderful? Joseph had the opportunity that few people get to realize for certain that God's hand had guided their life for a divine purpose. For Joseph, all those years of shame and rejection, of bondage, it was in order to save his people, not only his people, but the Egyptian people too, and many others too that got food from starvation, and to preserve that precious messianic seed from which would come the Son of God. By faith, Joseph, when he died, made mention of the departing of the children of Israel and gave commandment concerning his bones, Hebrews 11, verse 22. There he was, died age 110. He was embalmed, put in a coffin, had every right to be buried with royalty, but he believed that promises that God had made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that land promise, that messianic seed promise, that had been repeated over and over again. He believed that by faith. He knew that Israel would leave Egypt when the time was fulfilled, Genesis 15. 400 years later, Moses made sure his remains, and he by the way, Joseph said, "Don't bury me here. Take me out of here when you leave." Moses made sure those remains were taken out of the Exodus 13, verse 19, and the Israelites put him in the cave of Machpelah after they conquered Canaan, Joshua 24, verse 32. Brethren, how edifying it is to read how God works in the lives of the patriarchs to save you and me. These were real people with moments of weakness and great lives of faith. All of these faithful men and women had a realization that they were part of God's plan. What about us? 21st century, year 20, verse 14 of our Lord. We too are part of God's plan, God's purpose of the world, if we are a faithful Christian. Thank you very much.